You can't come in here. This house is rented through Sunday. Who are you?" The person saying that was a young man of about 30, red board shorts, a shark print t-shirt, blocking the front door of the house I had lived in for 22 years. The pale yellow beach house looking out over the Gulf of Mexico at Clearwater Beach, Florida. The house that Gerald and I had bought in 1999 with 20 years of savings and a small life insurance payout after my father died. My rolling suitcase still had red Yellowstone dirt on the wheels. I had been there for 3 full weeks, a solo trip I'd been planning since New Year's, as a gift to myself for my 63rd birthday. The taxi had dropped me at the curb at 3 o'clock Friday afternoon, October 4th. "I own this house," I said. The man looked at me the way people look when they don't believe what they just heard. "What do you mean?" "We booked this place on Airbnb through Kyle and Melissa. We paid in full. Kyle and Melissa, my son-in-law and my niece." I stood in front of my own door, suitcase beside me, the Florida afternoon sun pressing down on my back, and looked into my house over the young man's shoulder. Through the sliding glass door to the back, I could see 2 more people, a woman and a child, sitting at the pool deck chairs drinking coconut water. My name is Linda Grace Marchetti. I am 63 years old. I taught elementary school in Pinellas County for 30 years before retiring in 2018. I had lived in this house with Gerald until he died in 2021 from a stroke, and I had lived here alone since. And now I was standing outside my own front door like a stranger. "I need to reach Kyle," I said. "He's not here. He said if there were any issues to contact him through the app. As for you..." The man looked at me again. "You need to leave or we'll call the police for trespassing." I looked at this man standing in my doorway with the confidence of someone who had paid and believed that made it his right. Then I took out my phone and called Melissa. Melissa answered after 3 rings. "Mom, you're back?" Her voice wasn't surprised in the way of someone who didn't know what was coming. "Melissa, there are people in my house. Did you 2 put it on Airbnb?" "Can we talk about this later, Mom? I'm busy right now. There are guests booked through Sunday. You can't come in. Kyle said you could wait in the garage temporarily." The garage. In the small shed Gerald had built out back to store the car and garden tools. No air conditioning. A single overhead bulb. The smell of motor oil and damp earth. "Melissa," I said, my voice steady in the way that isn't truly steady, but is the steadiness of someone gripping each word so that no emotion spills into it. "This is my house. My name is on the title. Yes, it's your house. But you let us live here and take care of it? I'm just making a little extra. It's 2 more days. You can't wait 2 days?" I ended the call. The shark shirt man was still in the doorway, looking at me with the discomfort of someone caught in a situation they didn't want to be part of. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked, his voice softer this time. "I'll manage," I said. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "This isn't your fault." I wheeled my suitcase along the beachside path, the smell of salt and Gulf wind in my face, and called an Uber to the Holiday Inn 3 miles away. I didn't sit passively in the hotel. I'm not that kind of person. 30 years of elementary school teaching had shown me that problems don't disappear because you look away from them. Problems need to be solved, step by step, piece by piece. At 4 o'clock, after checking in and setting down my suitcase, I went back to the house. Not by knocking on the front door, I went straight to the side gate, whose key code I knew because I had set it myself in 2020. I needed to retrieve some documents from the small filing cabinet in the study off the kitchen. Not the deed itself, which was in the bank's safe deposit box, but copies of utility bills, last year's permit applications, things that confirmed I lived there. I was in the kitchen. My kitchen. With the coffee mugs hanging on the hooks Gerald put up in 2008, with the family photo still on the fridge, with the dill plant on the windowsill that I had grown from seed last year when the police arrived, Not one officer. 2, in full uniform, hands resting on their belts in the practiced way of people trained to stay ready. "Ma'am, we received a report of unlawful entry. Could you show us some ID?" The shark shirt man was at the kitchen doorway. He had called, or Melissa had called through him. And beside him was Kyle, my son-in-law, 38 years old, short hair, wearing a checked shirt in the manner of someone who doesn't want to look like they're trying but actually is. Kyle looked at me with an expression I won't forget. Not shame, not worry. The calculating look of someone assessing whether the situation is tracking according to plan. I took my driver's license from my wallet. "My name is Linda Grace Marchetti. The address on this driver's license is the address of this house, 412 Sunfish Court, Clearwater Beach, Florida. This is my home. I have lived here for 22 years. The first officer looked at the license, looked at the address, looked at me, then at Kyle. "And who are you?" "Kyle Brannigan, her son-in-law. We're managing this property and have legitimate guests. She's not permitted to enter without notice." "Son-in-law?" The officer turned to me. "Did you agree to let them manage the property?" I looked directly at the officer. I allowed them to live in my house because they needed a place after a bankruptcy. I never gave them permission to run an Airbnb without consulting me, to collect income from my property, and to block me from entering my own kitchen. A moment of silence in the kitchen. The smell of the ocean through the window. The steady hum of the air conditioning. "Mrs. Marchetti," the second officer said, "in this case, since your documents show this address, we don't have grounds to remove you from the premises. But this is a civil dispute, and we'd ask all parties to remain calm." Kyle looked at the officer with an unsatisfied expression. "She's disturbing our guests." "Your guests are in my house," I said. The first time that afternoon my voice had risen slightly. "I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm in my own home." In the end, I left voluntarily, not because of Kyle or the police or the shark shirt man, but because I had what I came for, and because I didn't want to make things harder for that unfortunate man and his family who had paid legitimately and knew nothing about the situation behind it. But I walked out the door with the folder of documents in hand and the small bag I'd collected from my bedroom, where someone else's clothes were in my closet, and headed back to the hotel. On the way, I stopped at a small cafe on Gulf Boulevard, ordered a black coffee, sat at a table near the window looking out at the water, and began to think. Not thinking in anger. Anger would come later. Right now, I was thinking in the way of an elementary school teacher. Step by step, in order, defining the problem before searching for the solution. The problem: Kyle and Melissa were running an Airbnb out of my house without my consent, collecting money from my property and blocking me from entering my own home. What I needed: the deed in the bank safe deposit box, an attorney, and information about what had happened while I was away for 3 weeks. Next steps: Saturday, go to the bank. Monday, meet with an attorney. I finished the coffee, looked out at the Gulf of Mexico shifting to orange in the late afternoon light, and thought, that house has watched this sunset every day for 22 years. It will watch it again in my hands. I need to tell you about this house, not in the financial or legal sense, but in the sense of a person who has lived in it and knows every corner of it. Gerald Anthony Marchetti and I bought this house in 1999 when we were both 40. We had lived in Tampa for 15 years in an ordinary row house with nothing particularly special about it, and both of us dreamed about the beach. Not a luxury dream. Gerald was an accountant for a shipping company. I taught elementary school. We weren't rich. But a dream of the kind that belongs to people who know that some things matter more than amenities and commute distance. My father died in 1997 and left a small life insurance payout, $25,000. He had been a carpenter his whole life and never thought he'd leave anything of much significance. I held that check in my hand and knew immediately what I wanted to do with it. A down payment on a beach house. 2 more years of saving, combined with my father's $25,000, and we put down the deposit on the pale yellow house at 412 Sunfish Court, Clearwater Beach. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, small kitchen, living room, opening to a veranda looking out on the Gulf of Mexico. Nothing grand, but it was ours, and it was on the water. Gerald painted the house for the first time in the summer of 2000. The pale yellow that I chose from a paint card at Home Depot, and he agreed to immediately without arguing, though he argued about most things. "This color looks like a Florida vacation rental," he said. "That's the idea," I said. And pale yellow it was. We didn't have children. Not for lack of wanting, but it didn't happen, and we gradually learned to live the life of 2 people and found it complete in its own way. Melissa wasn't my biological daughter. She was the child of Gerald's sister, Linda Marie, who died in 2016 from pancreatic cancer and left Melissa, then 28, on her own. Gerald died in 2021. I stood alone at the living room window, looking out at the water that evening after the ambulance had gone. In the house that had become suddenly quiet in a way that isn't ordinary quiet, and I said to the Gulf, "We bought this place together. I'll keep it." And I kept it. 3 years of living alone, handling the small repairs myself, hiring out the large ones, paying the bills from my pension and modest savings. Not easy, not in the financial sense, but in the loneliness of a person living alone in a house where every corner holds the memory of 2. Melissa Elena Brannigan, Brannigan being Kyle's name after their 2018 wedding, knocked on my door in November 2022 with red eyes and a small travel bag. "Aunt Linda," she said. She called me Aunt Linda because Gerald had been her uncle. "We don't have a place to stay anymore. Kyle's company went bankrupt. We lost the apartment. Kyle is looking for new work but hasn't found anything yet. I know you live alone and have an extra room." I looked at her in the porch light and didn't need to think long. "Come in," I said. "Take the back bedroom." The terms I gave them at that point were brief and I thought clear. Stay temporarily while you get back on your feet. Help around the house since I'm getting older and some things are hard to manage alone. Not permanent. That room was a guest room, not a rental. And Kyle Brannigan arrived a week later, alone, without Melissa, as though he wanted her to clear the way first. He shook my hand firmly and said, "Thank you, Aunt Linda. We won't let you down." I remember that sentence very clearly. The first 6 months were fine. Kyle went to job interviews, Melissa helped me clean the house and cook occasionally. They weren't home much, out and about, seeing friends, organizing their lives. The house wasn't as quiet as when I lived alone, but that wasn't a bad thing. There was a certain warmth to having people present. But 6 months passed and became 12. Kyle hadn't found stable work. A few short-term consulting contracts, but nothing steady. They started bringing more things in. The back bedroom filled up. Their clothes overflowed into the hallway. Kyle's old car started occupying the garage instead of the street. I said nothing. Not because I wasn't noticing. I noticed everything. But because I didn't want to create conflict when they were genuinely struggling, and because part of me thought this was family, at least Melissa was family, and family helps each other through hard times. But gradually, there were things I began to notice in the way that an elementary school teacher, after 30 years of observing behavior, notices. Kyle often answered calls in the back room with his voice lowered. He once asked me about property depreciation, without explaining why he wanted to know. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual and caught him photographing every room in the house with his phone in the manner of someone making a real estate listing. I asked about it. Kyle explained in some way. I don't recall exactly what he said, only that the reason sounded plausible enough that I didn't keep asking. I shouldn't have stopped asking. In 2024, July, I began planning the Yellowstone trip. 3 weeks. Solo. A trip I had been dreaming about since reading about Old Faithful in an 8th grade geography textbook. Gerald and I had meant to go, but never found the right time. I would go alone for my 63rd birthday. Before leaving, I told Kyle and Melissa, "Keep an eye on the house while I'm gone. Remember to water the plants and feed the cat. No additional conditions." Because I didn't think additional conditions were necessary. I didn't think this could happen. I was wrong. I want to say more about Gerald, because this house belongs to 2 people, and the story isn't complete without him. Gerald Anthony Marchetti was born in 1958 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the 3rd son in an Italian-American family of 5 children. His father worked in the mines. His mother kept the house and gave piano lessons to neighborhood children. Gerald grew up in a small house full of music and lively dinner table debates in the way of families that are never short of opinions. He was quiet in the way of someone who says little because they have nothing worth saying yet. Not the quiet of avoidance. When Gerald spoke, people listened because he didn't waste words on things that didn't matter. In 31 years of marriage, he never said anything to me that I later wished he hadn't said. That sounds simple, but isn't. So Gerald came to Clearwater in 1984, after the Pennsylvania mining industry declined, and he decided to change course. He studied accounting at night school while working construction during the day, and by 30, had both an accounting certificate and hands that knew how to fix anything in a house. We met in 1989 at a colleague's backyard barbecue. I was in my 5th year of teaching. He was an accountant for a shipping company. He didn't impress me dramatically at first. He impressed me slowly. Across subsequent meetings, I realized he was a genuine listener. Not listening while waiting for his turn to speak, but listening as though what the other person was saying actually mattered. The wooden chairs on the veranda, the ones I sit in watching the sunset, Gerald built from reclaimed lumber he bought at a salvage yard in Dunedin in 2003. He spent 3 weekends building 2 of them, one for me and one for himself. Not beautiful in any design sense. The lines were a little rough and plain, but solid and well-proportioned and never wobbled through all of Florida's rain seasons. "Why not just buy them at the store?" I asked, watching him sand wood in the garage one afternoon. "Because sitting in something you built feels different," he said, without looking up. After he died, I left his chair on the veranda for 6 months without anyone sitting in it. Not out of any unhealthy attachment, but because I didn't yet know how I felt about sitting in it. Then one morning, I sat in both of them. His chair first, looking out at the water, then mine, and understood that 2 chairs together was right even with only one person sitting. I didn't spend 3 days at the hotel entirely alone in silence. There was one important person I need to tell about. Sharon Whitmore, my friend of 20 years, the English teacher at the school next to mine until we both retired, called me Friday evening while I was sitting at the hotel desk with a folder of documents in front of me. "Linda, are you all right?" Sharon's voice wasn't the voice of social courtesy. It was the voice of someone who knew nobody was all right when sitting in a hotel that wasn't a vacation. I told her everything in about 20 minutes. Sharon listened without interrupting. That's what 20 years of close friendship teaches: when to listen and when to speak. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "You need a lawyer." "I know Diane Okafor. She handled my property line dispute with the neighbor last year. Very good. I'll text you her number in the morning." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me. Just promise me you won't let this make you stop traveling alone. That Yellowstone trip sounds wonderful." That made me laugh. The first time since the afternoon I'd looked at the phone screen showing 0. Sharon came to the hotel Saturday evening with a pizza and a cheap bottle of wine, and we sat on the bed watching television. We weren't watching and talked about everything. About Gerald, about Yellowstone, about the next travel plans we were both making, about being 63 and what was still ahead and what was behind. "You're handling this really well," Sharon said at one point. "I don't know if I'd be as calm as you." "I'm not calm," I said honestly. "I'm just doing the next thing that needs to be done." That's what I learned in 30 years of teaching elementary school. When everything is chaotic, do the next thing that needs doing. That's what Sharon helped me remember in those days. That I didn't have to handle everything at once. Just the next thing that needed doing. Kyle Brannigan grew up in Sarasota, Florida, the son of a small real estate family. His father had succeeded and then gone bankrupt in the 2008 housing crash. The kind of story Florida has thousands of versions of. Kyle studied business at the University of Florida and graduated with the idea that he would rebuild what his father had lost, only smarter. Not every plan follows its plan. The small real estate company Kyle started in 2020 entered the market right when Florida was hot, and he expanded too fast, borrowed too much, and when interest rates rose, there wasn't enough cash flow to navigate. The kind of story Florida also has thousands of versions of. I'm not telling this to excuse using my house as an Airbnb without asking me. That was wrong, regardless of whatever reason Kyle had. I'm telling it because I think there's something important in that cycle. The father who went bankrupt in the housing crash, the son who went bankrupt in the next wave, and in the crisis turning to family to solve things in a way that isn't a real solution. On the morning of Friday, October 11th, when Judge Davis read the ruling, I looked at Kyle and saw on his face something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not contempt, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been running from one thing to the next and had never really stopped to see where he was running to. I didn't pity him, but I didn't hate him either. I only thought, this is a person who needs to learn a different lesson from the one I need him to learn in this case. And that lesson isn't mine to teach. Melissa told me in January that she and Kyle had separated. I didn't ask for details because it wasn't my business. But when she came to visit me in April and asked about the dill plant without mentioning Kyle once, I understood that was the answer. Saturday morning, October 5th. I was at the Wells Fargo branch on Gulf to Bay Boulevard at 9 o'clock when they opened. My safe deposit box held the original deed from 1999, originals of major invoices and receipts over the years, and a small envelope I had put there after Gerald died. Inside was a handwritten note of his, with account numbers and important passwords. The kind of detail a forgetful wife might lose, but my careful husband had prepared. I took out the deed and looked at it under the bank office lights. Linda Grace Marchetti and Gerald Anthony Marchetti. Dated August 14th, 1999. Address, 412 Sunfish Court, Clearwater Beach, Florida, 33767. After Gerald died, I had updated the paperwork on my attorney's advice. The house was mine alone, no complications. The deed stood in the name of Linda Grace Marchetti, only me. Next, I asked the bank to print my account statements for the past 6 months. The young teller printed them and placed them in front of me, and I began reading. In those 6 months, from April through September, there were no unusual deposits to my account. That meant the Airbnb money wasn't going to my account. Where was it going? I took out my phone and searched. Airbnb listings can be found by address. I searched 412 Sunfish Court, Clearwater Beach, and found it immediately. A listing titled Beachside Paradise, Steps from Gulf, posted by an account named Kyle and Melissa B. Rental price, $270 per night in low season, $350 on weekends and in high season. This listing had been created in June, 2 months after I started planning the Yellowstone trip, and certainly before I actually left. Guest reviews, 56 reviews, most of them positive. 56 bookings. I sat in the bank and did simple arithmetic. If each booking averaged 3 nights, at an average price of $300 per night, that was approximately $50,000. Maybe more, maybe less. But that was money earned from my property, not going to my account, not reported under my name for taxes. I set down my phone and looked at the deed still in my hand. 56 bookings. Not a cent to my account, and I was staying at a hotel 3 miles from my own home. I met Diane Okafor on Monday, October 7th at 9 in the morning at her office on Cleveland Street in Clearwater. Diane Okafor was a Nigerian-American attorney, 55 years old, specializing in real estate law and property disputes. I found her through Sharon Whitmore, my friend from teaching, who had used Diane to resolve a boundary dispute with a neighbor the year before. I placed on Diane's desk the deed, screenshots of the Airbnb listing, 6 months of bank statements with no Airbnb income deposited, and a recording of my Friday phone call with Melissa. I had announced I was recording, which was a practice I had adopted for all important conversations since a former colleague had advised it after a minor insurance dispute the previous year. Diane went through everything in about 15 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. "Your case is legally clear," she said. "You are the sole owner. They have no valid lease agreement with you, pay you no rent, and are collecting income from your property without your consent. That is a violation of your property rights." "They'll say I agreed verbally," I said. "Possibly. But in this phone recording, your niece acknowledges they were running the Airbnb without telling you beforehand. The phrase, 'you can't wait 2 days,' acknowledges you didn't know and didn't consent." Diane made a note. "There's something else that's more significant. The Airbnb income wasn't reported." "You mean taxes?" Airbnb provides income information to the IRS when it exceeds a certain threshold. If they collected around $50,000 from your property this year and didn't declare it, that's a serious IRS matter. Diane looked at me. "How far do you want to take this?" "I want my house back," I said, "immediately, and I want what happened to have real legal consequences." "All right, we'll work 2 tracks in parallel. First, I'll file for an emergency eviction order. Since they have no valid lease and are paying no rent, they are unlawful occupants without legal standing, and Florida has an expedited process for this. Second, I'll prepare a Form 3 949-A report to the IRS regarding suspected tax underreporting related to unreported rental income from property you own." "The IRS will take months," I said. "The IRS will take months," Diane agreed. "But we don't need the IRS to complete its investigation to get the house back. The eviction is the faster route." She looked at me. "And the rental income they collected, do you want to pursue recovery?" "I want to recover everything collected from my property," I said, "but the house comes first." "House first?" Diane nodded and started typing. "Wednesday I file?" Diane didn't come to America with everything provided. She was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and arrived in the United States at 18 on a university scholarship with no family here. After college, she went to law school, worked at a large firm for 10 years, then opened her own practice in Clearwater in 2015 when she decided she wanted to work with the local community rather than big corporations. She told me that in a conversation after my case was resolved, not because I asked, but because we were having coffee after the damages hearing and the conversation went that way. "I like working on cases like yours," she said. "Not because they're easy, but because they matter. Protecting the property rights of older adults living alone is something not everyone cares about. But it's necessary." What Diane taught me wasn't about the law. That was her domain. What she taught me was about one's attitude toward the legal system. Don't fear it. The legal system isn't something only for the wealthy or the legally trained. It's a system you have the right to access and use when your rights are violated. The property deed was a piece of paper I had, and that paper had real legal meaning when I was willing to use it. "You did the most important thing," Diane told me once. "You had your documents and you knew where they were. Many people don't, or they have them, but don't know where they are or what they mean. That's the difference." After the October story, I started consulting Diane on a few other things: updating my will, adjusting the property documents to be clearer about access conditions in an emergency, and setting up a healthcare proxy just in case. Things I should have done after Gerald died, but had put off thinking I didn't need to yet. It turns out you always need to. Wednesday, October 9th, Diane filed 2 things the same day. First, an emergency eviction petition at Pinellas County Circuit Court. Grounds: unlawful occupation, no lease agreement, no rent paid, unauthorized commercial use of the property causing harm to the owner. Second, a Form 3949-A filed with the IRS regarding suspected tax misreporting related to unreported rental income from real property. I don't know exactly when Kyle and Melissa received the court notification on Wednesday, but by Wednesday evening, Melissa called me. "Aunt Linda, why are you doing this? You know how hard things are for us right now." I said calmly, "Melissa, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm exercising my legal rights over my own property. Kyle says this is retaliation. Melissa, let me say one thing, and then speak with your attorney. I can't discuss this further over the phone. Everything goes through counsel." I ended the call. Sitting in the hotel chair, looking at the dark television screen, I realized I hadn't cried since this whole thing had started. Not because I wasn't sad or hurt, but because there are times when you need to finish the work that needs finishing first, and the feelings will come when they come. I thought about Gerald. How would he handle this situation? He was calm, quiet, but when it came to something he believed was right, nobody could move him. "Linda," he used to say, "being good-hearted and being a pushover aren't the same thing. A good person knows when to say no." I should have heard that sentence longer before Wednesday in October. The hearing at Pinellas County Circuit Court was Friday morning, October 11th at 10 o'clock. Kyle and Melissa arrived with an attorney they had hired in a hurry, a young man with a thin file and the expression of someone who knows which side he's on, is going to lose. Diane Okafor sat beside me in her black suit with a color-tabbed and precisely organized binder. The judge was a 60-year-old man named Arthur Davis, who had been on the Pinellas County bench long enough not to be impressed by anyone and to care only about documents. Diane presented for 15 minutes. The deed, no lease agreement, no rent paid to the owner, evidence of Airbnb income going to a separate account, the phone recording. When Kyle's attorney argued that his client had been living in the house with the verbal consent of the owner and was managing the property on her behalf during her absence. "Managing the property on the owner's behalf," Judge Davis read back. "No management contract. No payments made to the owner. Rental income not transferred to the owner." He paused and looked at Kyle over his glasses. "Can you explain how that constitutes managing on someone's behalf when all the income went into your pocket?" Kyle didn't answer right away. His attorney leaned over and whispered something. "We intended to repay Mrs. Marchetti once we were financially stable," Kyle said at last. "But you haven't paid her yet," Judge Davis said. "And currently, Mrs. Marchetti is staying in a hotel while others collect income from her house." He tapped the bench lightly. "Once the eviction petition is granted, Kyle Brannigan and Melissa Brannigan have 48 hours to vacate the property at 412 Sunfish Court, Clearwater Beach, Florida." He continued. "The court also notes the request for damages related to unauthorized income from the property. That portion will be addressed at a separate hearing. However, the eviction order takes effect immediately. 48 hours. By Sunday, October 13th, Kyle and Melissa had to be out of my house. There's a small part of this story I want to tell because it speaks to something beautiful. in a story where not everything is beautiful. The shark shirt man, the one who had blocked my door Friday afternoon, was named Brian Holler, 32 years old, from Nashville, visiting with his wife and 8-year-old daughter. His family had booked my house for a late-year beach vacation 3 months earlier, paid in full at the listed rate. After I left that Friday, Brian called Kyle and asked for an explanation. Kyle told him that a neighbor had come in without a reason. Brian didn't entirely believe it, but didn't know what else to do. Sunday, when Brian and his family were leaving, he saw me standing at the gate with Diane Okafor as he was loading the car. He came over to me and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry about Friday. I didn't know you were actually the owner." "You don't need to apologize," I said. "You paid legitimately and you didn't know the situation." "We'll be requesting a refund from Airbnb," he said. "This was misrepresented to us. I hope Airbnb also compensates you, since they let this listing exist." He and his family got in the car. His daughter, the 8-year-old with a ponytail and kid sunglasses, waved through the window as they pulled away. I stood watching and thought, there are good people who wander into stories that aren't theirs and still try to do the right thing. Brian Holler was that person in my story. Airbnb, when Diane contacted them with documentation proving it was an unauthorized listing, suspended Kyle and Melissa's account and refunded the most recent guests. The process took a few weeks, but it happened. After the hearing, Diane and I were having coffee at a cafe beside the courthouse when Kyle appeared alone. No Melissa, no attorney. He sat in the chair across from me without being invited, in the way of someone accustomed to controlling situations and not yet accustomed to not being able to. "Aunt Linda," he began, not Mrs. Marchetti anymore. "Aunt Linda, using family closeness as a tool. Can we talk? Without the lawyers." I looked at him. Diane looked at me, and I gave a small nod that I was fine. "You can talk," Diane said to him, "but anything said here may be used in the next hearing." Kyle didn't look at Diane. He looked at me. "You know how hard things are for Melissa. You know we didn't have many options. I was trying to create income the only way I could. From someone else's property," I said, without asking, without sharing, without notice. "I'm sorry." His voice didn't sound like an apology. It sounded the way people speak when they think apologizing is the first step toward getting someone to give ground. I could return part. "Kyle," I said, my voice not angry, but calm in the way of genuine calm. "I'm not having this conversation with you outside a legal setting, not because I don't forgive you, but because the court order is clear and all negotiations need to go through attorneys. Not because I hate you, but because that's the right way to do things." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Did you know Melissa cried all of last night?" That sentence hit exactly where he meant it to hit. I knew Melissa, the girl I had watched grow up through family gatherings, who had sat beside Gerald's hospital bed while he was dying and cried as if she were losing her own father. Melissa wasn't a bad person. Melissa was someone who had done a wrong thing under someone else's influence. But a bad person and doing something wrong are two different things, and the consequences of something wrong don't disappear because the person who did it isn't bad. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "I genuinely am. But it doesn't change my decision." Kyle stood up, looked at me one more time in the way he perhaps thought would make me change my mind, then walked out the door. Sunday, October 13th, at 2 p.m, Diane came with me to 412 Sunfish Court to make sure the handover happened as the court order required. A small moving truck was parked out front. Kyle and Melissa were carrying things out: cardboard boxes, bags of clothes, a flat-screen TV I had never seen before, and which certainly wasn't mine. A friend of Kyle's was helping with the move. Melissa saw me when I came through the front gate. She stopped with a cardboard box in her hands, looked at me, and I saw on her face what I had been looking for since the beginning of this story and hadn't seen until this moment. Not Kyle's tactical apology, but the look of someone who genuinely understood what they had done. "Aunt Linda," she said. She set the cardboard box down. "I'm sorry." I looked at her. A 36-year-old woman with red eyes, hair pulled back hastily, wearing a faded t-shirt. The child I had watched grow up through family gatherings. "I hear you," I said. "I know there's nothing that can explain it. I know I did something wrong." Her voice shook. "I don't know how I ended up doing this. You were always good to me, and Melissa," I said gently, "I don't need an explanation today. And I don't need an apology today in order to forgive you eventually. Those things take time, and they can't happen at a front gate with cardboard boxes." She nodded, looked down, looked back at me. "Are you okay?" "I'll be okay," I said. And this time I meant it. Melissa picked up her cardboard box and kept carrying things out. Kyle looked at me once from across the truck, said nothing, just looked, then turned away. Diane and I went inside to check. The back bedroom was still a mess. A few things they'd left behind or forgotten. The kitchen was cleaner than I expected. The living room smelled of other people, strange perfume and food I hadn't cooked. But the living room window looking out to the veranda, looking out to the Gulf of Mexico, was still there. And out there, the water was still there. I want to talk about 22 years in this house, because 22 years isn't just time. It's what happened during that time. In 2004, Hurricane Charlie hit Clearwater Beach, and our house lost part of the south side overhang. Gerald and I stayed inside, not out of bravery, but because we hadn't evacuated in time, and sat in the bathroom wrapped in mattress covers while the storm passed. Afterward, when the sky cleared and we stepped out to look at the stripped overhang, Gerald said, "At least we know the house is solid. The overhang is just an extra." In 2007, a former student of mine, a girl named Jasmine, then 16, and in a hard stretch with her family, knocked on my door one evening because she had nowhere to go. I let her sleep on the living room couch for 3 nights while I made calls to social services to find a better arrangement. Gerald didn't ask many questions, just put out an extra pillow and asked what she wanted for breakfast. In 2013, my mother came to stay with us for 3 months after breaking her hip. She lived in the back bedroom, the same bedroom where Melissa and Kyle would later stay. My mother sat on the veranda every morning looking at the water, and one day she said to me, "Linda, not everyone has this. You know that, don't you?" I knew. In 2021, Gerald died on August 16th. I stood at the living room window after the ambulance drove away and looked out at the water in the silence of a person who hasn't yet fully understood what just happened. Biscuit jumped up on the windowsill and stood beside me, looking out in the direction I was looking. We stood that way for about 15 minutes. 22 years of things like that. Not just the large moments, but thousands of mornings with coffee, thousands of dinners, thousands of times looking at the water when the sky changed with the seasons. That's what lives inside the walls of 412 Sunfish Court, the things that don't appear in an Airbnb listing and aren't mentioned in legal documents. And that's why I had stood at my own front door with Yellowstone dirt on my suitcase and not walked away. In 3 nights at the Holiday Inn 3 miles from home, there were moments when I couldn't sleep and lay looking at the hotel ceiling in the dark and thinking. Not thinking about legal matters or money or what would happen next. Thinking in the way people think at 3 a.m. when there's nothing to do but look straight at the hard questions. The hardest question was, where did I go wrong with Melissa? Not, I was wrong to let them stay. That's not a useful question. Helping family when they need it is the right thing. The question is, what did I fail to do that I should have done? And did that failure contribute to what happened? The answer I arrived at after 3 nights was, I never talked plainly with Melissa about my boundaries. Not once, not clearly. I let them stay because I thought I was helping. And that was right. But I never said, here are the things I need from you for this to work. Here are the things that aren't acceptable. Here's when we need to revisit this. I gave without saying the conditions. And when there are no clear conditions, the person receiving doesn't know where the line is until they cross it, and by then, it's too late for everyone. That doesn't excuse Kyle or Melissa. They did something wrong, and they knew it. The evidence was in how they acted. How Kyle calculated and concealed. How Melissa answered the phone without surprise. People who don't know they're doing wrong don't need to conceal it. But I can hold responsibility for my part while not holding responsibility for their part. Those two things aren't contradictory. I failed to state clear conditions. That was my part. They chose to exploit that absence of conditions. That was their part. Both are true, and both need to be acknowledged if I want to learn from this, rather than only saying I was the victim. On the 3rd hotel night, I made a decision. I would not live the story of I was the victim going forward. Not because what happened to me wasn't unjust. It was. But the victim story doesn't give me the power to change anything, including the things I can change. I took out my phone and wrote a note. Clear conditions, always put them in writing. Documents, know where they are and what they mean. Small signs, don't ignore them because you don't want to face them. 3 things. Then I turned off the phone and slept. I forgot to mention 2 small but important things. The cat and the dill plant. The cat's name was Biscuit, named by Gerald because its golden brown color looked like baked biscuits. Biscuit was 11 years old, living in the house since she was a kitten that a former student brought me in 2013. When I left for Yellowstone, I reminded Melissa to take care of Biscuit. When I came back, Biscuit wasn't inside the house. She was sitting on the front step, waiting in the patient way of a cat who knows exactly who she's waiting for. I don't know how Biscuit navigated 3 weeks of strangers coming and going in the house. But when I sat down and she jumped into my lap according to her usual habit, I felt the tension ease in a way that can't be explained rationally. The dill plant on the kitchen windowsill, the plant I had grown from seed last year, which was about a foot tall before I left, was still alive when I came back, though it looked a bit underwatered. Someone among the Airbnb guests, or Kyle or Melissa, had watered it, even if not regularly. That small thing mattered to me in the way it matters to someone who understands that life continues even while you're going through things that aren't small. Biscuit was waiting, the dill was alive, and I came home. People often ask what 30 years of teaching taught me, and I answer in different ways depending on context. But the truest and least often spoken answer is this: children learn from how adults handle problems, not from what adults tell them they should do. I taught more than 600 elementary school students across 30 years. Not all of them remember my name or any specific lesson, but some of them, somewhere in the memory they don't necessarily know, is memory. Remember how Miss Marchetti handled it when a child fell and cried. No panic, no dismissal, just sitting down at the child's level and working through it step by step. When I stood at my own front door with Yellowstone dirt on my suitcase and heard, "You can't come in here," my first response wasn't shouting or crying or standing there not knowing what to do. My first response was, what's the problem? What information do I have? What's the next step? That's the reflex of 30 years of standing in front of a classroom with 25 8-year-olds and learning that the adult in the room needs to be calmer than any child in the room. I don't consider that special or heroic. I consider it what 30 years of real work leaves in a person. Not theoretical knowledge, but practical reflex. Teaching isn't heroic in the way people tend to imagine, but it builds specific things: patience, observation, and the ability to distinguish between what is urgent and what is important. When I heard, "Your pension is enough to live on," from Melissa over the phone, that 30-year reflex recognized it immediately. This is how people tend to excuse taking what isn't theirs, by redefining the needs of the person losing the thing. She wasn't saying, "I was wrong," or "I'm sorry." She was saying, "You don't need that much." Those two sentences are completely different things. Teaching also taught me this. When a child does something wrong, and the adult doesn't set a consequence out of compassion, the child doesn't learn the lesson. They only learn that when caught, the adult will back down if you're pitiful enough. Kyle and Melissa weren't children. They were adults of 36 and 38. But the principle still applies. Consequences aren't punishment. They're part of the complete picture, without which the lesson isn't finished. By 4 o'clock, Kyle and Melissa had gone. The truck had left Sunfish Court. Diane shook my hand, said she'd be in touch about the upcoming damages hearing, and also left. I stood alone in my house. Not the first time I had stood alone in this house. I had lived here alone for 3 years since Gerald died. But this was the first time that being alone felt like reclaiming something, not losing something. I walked through each room, not to assess damage or clean right away, just walked. The living room with the sea blue sofa that Gerald and I bought in 2007 because we both thought the color went with the water. The kitchen with the mugs on Gerald's hooks, still in the right place. The main bedroom with the old mirror my father had framed from driftwood he picked up on the beach when I was 15, which I had moved through 3 homes. Then I walked out to the back veranda. The Gulf of Mexico at 4:30 on a clear water beach October afternoon is something you have to see to understand why people buy houses here and hold on to them through everything. The water that aquamarine shade near the shore gradually deepening to dark green farther out, in the way that the Florida afternoon light makes the whole expanse look like it's glowing from within. I sat in the old wooden chair on the veranda, the chair Gerald had built from reclaimed lumber and which I had repainted white twice since he died to keep it from deteriorating. I held the cup of coffee I had made in my own kitchen, from the coffee in my own cabinet, with my own kettle. And I watched the sunset, not thinking about the IRS or the upcoming damages hearing or what Kyle and Melissa would do next. Not thinking about the 56 reviews still existing on their Airbnb listing with photos of my house. Not thinking about anything complicated. I watched the sunset and remembered the first time Gerald and I sat here after moving in. September 1999. We were 40 years old, drinking cold beer and not saying much because there wasn't much that needed saying. Just sitting and watching and knowing this was right. And I remembered the last time I had sat here with Gerald, August 2021, 3 weeks before his stroke. He wasn't feeling well, but we didn't know why yet. We sat looking at the water in silence, and I remember him saying, "Linda, if I go first, keep this house. Don't sell it. This house needs to be lived in." I had kept that promise. A Florida sunset in October is slow and brilliant. Not a flash, but a 30-minute process as the sky shifts from gold to orange, to red to purple, and finally to the deep blue of night arriving. I sat through all of it without standing up, without looking at my phone. When it began to darken, I thought about the sentence I would say if someone asked me what I had learned from this October. Kindness needs limits. Otherwise, it becomes foolishness. People often ask why you'd live in Florida. With the hurricanes, with the brutal summers, with insurance rates that have spiked and a cost of living that isn't what it used to be. The practical answer is, people stay because of the Gulf of Mexico. Not because Florida's water is scientifically superior to water elsewhere, but because the Gulf of Mexico on Florida's western side has a color that no place I've been to has. That aquamarine shallow near the shore shifting to deep green offshore in the way that Florida afternoon light makes the whole expanse look like it's glowing from within. Gerald saw that color for the first time in 1999 when we came to look at the house, and he said, "Linda, we're buying this place." Just that. No discussion about price, no comparison with the other houses we'd seen. Just a look out the living room window and a decision. I had doubted that decision a few times in 22 years. When Charlie took the overhang, when insurance spiked after the terrible 2004 storm season, when the cost of maintaining a beach house proved higher than a regular home. But every time I sat on the veranda in the afternoon and looked at that color, I understood why Gerald only needed one look to decide. When I reclaimed the house in October and sat watching the sunset for the first time alone, what I felt wasn't triumph or relief or any large emotion, just a simple recognition. This is my place. I'm exactly where I should be. Not because of the house or the legal documents or anything external, but because I had done the right thing, protected what deserved to be protected. And that has its own feeling, a quiet certainty of a kind that violence or failure don't give you, but truth does. Gerald used to say, a sunset doesn't wait for anyone, but it doesn't disappear either. It comes at exactly its own time every day, and whoever is there sees it, and whoever isn't there misses it. October 13th, I was there. The weeks that followed weren't without developments. Life doesn't simplify itself into a story that ends at a beautiful sunset. The IRS opened an investigation in late November. That process moved the way federal agencies move, steadily and without hurry. Diane told me that with the amount of unreported income and the property being used for commercial activity without a Clearwater business license, Kyle and Melissa faced significant penalties. Not just unpaid taxes, but fines and interest. The damages hearing was in December. The court ruled that Kyle and Melissa owed me the Airbnb income corresponding to the time I was unable to be in my own home, about $12,000 after deducting reasonable expenses. Not the full $50,000. The rest would take more legal steps and more months. But $12,000 was a start. Melissa called me in January, not about money or legal matters, but to say she and Kyle had separated. Her voice sounded like someone who had just set down something heavy they had been carrying too long. "I'm not surprised," she said. "No," I admitted. "But I'm sad. Not because Kyle's gone, but because you carried too much of that alone for too long." Melissa was quiet for a moment. Then, "Aunt Linda, can you teach me how to garden? You grow that dill on the windowsill. I want to learn." That question, not an apology, not a request for money, not a demand or explanation, surprised me in the best possible way. It sounded like a real question, from someone starting to think about something beyond the crisis. "Yes," I said. "Come whenever you're ready." I don't know where that leads. Don't know whether Melissa and I will build something back or not. Some wounds need time, and time isn't always enough. But the question about the dill plant is a starting point if there's any starting point at all. 6 months after getting the house back, I sat in the same wooden chair on the veranda and looked at the water and thought about what I had done wrong. The first thing, I didn't put the conditions in writing when I let them stay. Temporarily was something clear in my head at the time, but not clear for the people receiving it. No time frame, no terms, no document. Two people in a crisis don't have the capacity to remember or respect verbal conditions when circumstances change. Practical lesson, when letting family members stay, whether biological family or family like Melissa, have a written agreement. Not because you don't trust them, but because a document protects both sides. It protects you from misunderstanding, and it protects them from a situation where they can't defend themselves later. The second thing, I noticed the small signs. Kyle photographing the house room by room, the odd question about property depreciation, his voice lowering during calls. And I didn't follow up. I convinced myself with explanations that sounded just plausible enough. That's what people tend to do when they don't want to face what something might mean. Find reasons not to have to face it. The third thing, I never considered the worst case scenario. Not because I wasn't intelligent, but because Melissa is family created a blind spot in my thinking. Family doesn't mean someone who can't do wrong by you. Sometimes family is the person with the most access to your vulnerabilities. I'm telling these things not to blame myself. I handled the situation correctly after it happened, and I have no regrets about that. I'm telling them because other people make the same mistakes for the same reasons. And maybe reading this before facing a similar situation makes a difference. Gerald used to say, "Linda, people can't take what you haven't given them access to." He wasn't saying that about a house or money. He was saying it about love and trust. But it applies to everything, including a beach house. January 2025, I began planning the next trip. Not because the October incident no longer affected me. It still did, in the way that things don't disappear completely, but become part of a larger picture. But because I thought Sharon was right. Don't let this make me stop living the way I want to live. The next trip I was planning was Ireland, England and Wales and Ireland for 4 weeks, solo, in June. Gerald and I had talked about that trip since 2015, but never made it happen. He wasn't here to go with me, but our house was still here, and I was still here, and that was enough to keep going. This time, I did what I should have done before Yellowstone. Told the neighbors on both sides that I'd be away and asked them to keep an eye on things. Changed the locks and didn't give anyone except Sharon the new code. And, most importantly, I wrote a short note and stuck it on the fridge. Emergency contact information, the vet's number for Biscuit, and a simple line. This is a private residence, not a rental property. Those small things guaranteed nothing completely. Nothing guarantees anything completely. But they were the right next steps for someone who had learned a lesson and decided to live smarter going forward. That January Saturday morning, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and searched for flights to Dublin in June. Biscuit jumped into my lap right on schedule. Outside the kitchen window, the dill plant was growing the way plants grow when they're watered enough and get enough sun. I found a reasonable flight and booked it. No hesitation. No waiting for anyone to agree or disagree. That's what the October story taught me as clearly as anything. My life is mine. Not in a selfish or uncaring way, I still cared about Melissa. I still thought about my mother and friends and former students. I was still the person Sharon would call when she needed something, and I would answer. But in the sense that I had the right to live the things I wanted to live in my own house, with my own plans, without explaining to anyone why. April 2025, the dill plant on my kitchen windowsill began to flower. Small white blooms in the way of the carrot family, delicate and unassuming. Melissa came to visit on a Saturday morning. She brought pastries from Portos on Bayshore Boulevard, the kind that Gerald and I used to buy every Sunday morning in the years when we still lived in Tampa, and which Melissa knew because she used to visit us back then. We sat on the veranda drinking coffee and eating pastry, not talking much about what had happened, not avoiding it, but because enough had been said, and now was the time for other things. "Teach me to grow dill," Melissa reminded me of what she'd said in January. "All right," I said. "But you should know that growing dill isn't fast. You have to wait." "I know how to wait," she said, and her voice sounded like someone who truly did. We went out to the small garden along the side of the house, the garden that Gerald and I had planted with vegetables and herbs since 2003, when we read an article about urban kitchen gardens and decided to try. I showed Melissa how to prepare the soil, how to choose the pot, how to water without overwatering. That morning didn't resolve everything between Melissa and me. Nothing could be resolved in a single morning, but it was the beginning of something neither of us yet knew what it would become. And that was all right. I write these words on a June evening, sitting on the back veranda of my house in Clearwater Beach, watching the Gulf of Mexico deepening to the blue-black of night coming on. 8 months since the day I stood at my own front door with Yellowstone dirt on my suitcase and heard the shark shirt man tell me I couldn't come in. The house is my house again, in the legal sense and in the feeling sense. I repainted the back bedroom pale blue because the old color had faded, and because I wanted a new color that wasn't one someone else had chosen. I rehung the things I wanted to hang, kept what I wanted to keep, and let go of what it was time to let go. The IRS investigation is still ongoing. These things move at their own slow pace. Diane has told me Kyle and Melissa's fines will be significant, but I don't need to know the exact number to keep living my own life. That isn't what I follow day by day. There are things I want to say to anyone who reads this story, not as moral lessons from someone who thinks themselves perfect, because I'm not perfect, and I made specific mistakes that I've described, but as the words of a 63-year-old who has lived through this and is on the other side of it. The first is the most practical. Documents. Your house, your bank accounts, any significant asset. Know exactly where those papers are and make sure you understand what's in them. When you give anyone access to your property, whether co-ownership or letting them stay or any other arrangement, have a clear written record of the conditions. Not because you don't trust them, but because a document protects both sides and reduces the chance of misunderstanding leading to something worse. The second is harder. Kindness needs limits. This doesn't mean stop being kind or stop helping family when they need it. It means you can be kind and still say no when necessary. You can love someone and still not let them take things that aren't theirs. You can forgive someone and still set consequences for what they did. Those things aren't contradictory. The third is what I think about most looking back, the small signs. There are times when your instinct tells you something isn't right. Kyle photographing every room, the odd question about property assets, the lowered voice during calls. I noticed those things and chose not to act because I didn't want to face what they might mean. If I could do it over, I would ask directly and sooner. Not out of suspicion or anxiety, but because an honest, direct question early sometimes prevents something much worse later. And fourth, what I learned from the afternoon sitting on the veranda watching the sunset alone. There are things that belong to you, not because they're expensive or legally important, but because they contain your life. The memories, the love, the right and wrong decisions you made, the people you shared space with. The pale yellow house on Sunfish Court isn't just real estate. It's where Gerald and I sat drinking beer and looking at the water at 40 years old and knew that this was right. That thing is worth protecting. The Gulf wind moves across the veranda. A white egret flies across the darkening sky. Somewhere down the beach, soft music from a restaurant a few houses away. I take the last sip of coffee from my cup and set it down. The house behind me, pale yellow, kitchen with the mugs on the hooks, dill on the windowsill, my father's driftwood mirror in the bedroom, is there, quiet and in its right place. Gerald, I say quietly to the water, in the habit I've had since he died. I kept it, just like you said. The sea doesn't answer. It doesn't need to. Kindness needs limits. Otherwise, it becomes foolishness. And I, Linda Grace Marchetti, 63 years old, retired teacher, keeper of the pale yellow house on Sunfish Court, person who reclaimed her own sunset, I learned that the hard way, not in any textbook. But now I know, and I won't forget.